stuck between a libertarian and a Republican? Welcome to Publitarian Podcast.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. This is Ronald Johnson, Publitarian, coming at you again with another episode of Publitarian Podcast, and I'm very excited to have this next guest on with me. Tell us about the next guest, Mr. Announcer.
And now, Publitarian Studios is proud to present international journalist, educator, author, and consultant who is working to save American children from government education, Alex Newman.
That's right. Today on the line with me, I have Alex Newman. How are you doing today, Alex?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for having me on the program.
Thank you for being on. And I wanted to get a brief synopsis of your background and expertise in education.
Yeah, well, thank you again. And it starts off with the fact that I'm a teacher, which is fun. I love teaching. I love education. And I really got involved in this fight back in like 2010, 2011, writing for the New American Magazine. I started coming across these news reports where they kind of acted like it was a done deal that we were going to have these new national standards called Common Core. I was like, wait a minute, national standards? That doesn't sound like a good idea. So I started digging into it, and sure enough, it was an absolutely terrible idea, and started exposing that. And then a couple years later, I was asked by Samuel Blumenfeld, Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld, who I think is one of our nation's leading, but he's passed on now. He passed on in 2015, but he was one of our nation's leading educational experts. He spent 60 years of his life studying education. He wrote a lot of, I think, the most important books on education ever published in the United States, ranging from his Public Education Necessary to The New Illiterates, to How to Tutor, just an incredible wealth of knowledge. I mean, this is a guy who went back and pulled the information out of the archives and the universities and the correspondence that probably would have been lost forever. And he's often called one of the founding fathers of the homeschool movement. So I was asked to work on a book with him as a co-author, the book Crimes of the Educators, and that was published in 2015. It ended up really getting me up to speed on what I should have known all along about education. It was such an honor and a privilege to work with him. I got basically 60 years of his research crammed into my brain in a matter of 1 year. So, and around that time is when I had this realization that, oh my goodness, if we don't do something about this, America's done. I mean, we're toast. Our liberties are gone. Our country's gone. Our republic is going to be gone. Our churches, our families. I mean, everything is on the line here. So that kind of culminated in 2019. We put together a special report in the New American Magazine. I'm actually holding a copy in my hand. It's called Rescuing Our Children, where we basically break down what's happening in the public school system, the history of that, how the kids are getting dumber and dumber every year, how the schools are sexualizing them now and promoting this LGBT stuff. We get into the future, where this is all going, the United Nations, their growing role in education, and really a lot on what education should look like. So we have an article on homeschooling, we have an article on Christian education, and we finally conclude with urging parents to get their children out of the system as quickly as they can. And we took this issue of the magazine. We're aiming to distribute 1 million copies. We've got a ways to go, but we're making a lot of progress. We're on our 7th printing now, I believe. And I turned that into a talk. And this entire summer, I actually met a mutual friend of ours in Montana as we were on the speaking tour. But loaded my family up in a travel trailer, and we went across the country. I gave, I think so far we're at about 60 speeches on rescuing our children across 32 or 33 states now, basically breaking this down for parents. What's happening in the public school system? Where did it come from? How did we get here? Where is it going? And what do you need to do about it? And that kind of brings us to today. I'll be flying out tomorrow to go give another talk on education in Phoenix, and got a lot more scheduled. But that's kind of my story on education in a nutshell. I mentioned I'm a teacher. I teach advanced economics for high school seniors through the Freedom Project Academy, and just have a lot of fun doing it. And again, I think education is the most important issue, so that's one of the reasons I'm thrilled to be able to come on the show. Thank you very much, Ron.
No, you're welcome. And you actually covered like all four of the questions I wanted to ask you all at once. That was perfect. You like the perfect guest.
Okay, my bad.
No, that's great. What I wanted to ask, so you teach economics as well, and I know that that is not being, well, if it's being taught with a slant, but I don't think it's given enough attention anymore in our education system. So it's interesting that economics is your field on teaching.
Yeah, I mean, what passes for education and economics in the public school system today, and even in a lot of private schools, is an absolute joke. I've looked, for example, at AP Economics, the advanced placement, and I was just flabbergasted with how idiotic this curriculum is. I do teach my students so that they can ace these AP tests and so they can get, pass on the CLEP tests and all that. But what happens is, in the field of economics, they teach economics from the Keynesian perspective without even telling you that they're teaching economics from the Keynesian perspective. Now, Keynesians have a worldview and a view on government. They believe that government's role should be to be actively involved in the economy, to actively manage what happens in the economy. When you have the boom part of the cycle, government is supposed to do certain things, and when you have the bust part of the cycle, government's supposed to spend all kinds of money. And
Right.
They're entitled to their opinion, and they're entitled to teach their opinion to children. But let's not pretend like this is some sort of objective science that mandates Keynesianism. So I do teach my students, if you take the AP test, if you take the CLEP test for economics, they will treat Keynesianism as if it were true, as opposed to being one as opposed to being one opinion among many in terms of how do we understand the economy, how do we understand economics. So my students should be able to ace those tests, and I know from experience that they do ace those tests, but I don't teach them that Keynesianism is gospel truth, just that it's just one way of trying to understand economics. And in fact, I teach much more so from the Austrian perspective. But I tell my students that, I tell them I think this is the correct way of understanding these things. But, this comes from the Austrian school as contrasted with the Keynesian school. So, it's interesting that we talk about this because I think it highlights a broader problem in the educational system. And that is that the school system has kind of glommed onto one particular ideology or one particular worldview. And then they teach it to students as if that were the only legitimate view to have. And this is so obviously wrong. It's so obviously harmful to the students, and yet it happens all day, every day, all across America.
That's very interesting because another thing that I picked up on that you said is you are an advocate, a strong advocate of homeschooling and how important education is. Where are you at with public education? Is it something that we need to discard and put the parents back in the roles of doing this teaching? Or have we placed too much of a value on higher learning versus trades or just getting out and getting a job? Where do you land on that?
Yeah, that's the $500 million question right now. And my views have evolved over the years. Views have evolved on this subject. And I have now come to the conclusion after reading an endless amount of books, we actually made a mistake by allowing the government to take over education. First of all, as a Christian, I take the Bible as God's word, and God's word is very clear about who ought to be in charge of education. Over and over and over again, crystal clear, parents should be in charge of education, not the government. From a pragmatic point of view, and even just looking at the history, I think we made an enormous mistake as a society in moving in the direction of having the government take over schools. Partly because I think intellectual diversity and educational diversity is important. Parents ought to be the primary educators of their children, but they have the authority to delegate some of that authority out to others. The problem is when you have the government come in and try to standardize it, you lose that diversity. First of all, you get kind of like a one-size-fits-all model, and that's really what we have not just in the United States today, but increasingly around the world with UNESCO trying to standardize everything. But another thing that I've looked at is the history of public education. Where did it come from and why did we get it? And very few people know this history. And the only reason I know it is because Dr. Blumenfeld, the trailblazer, dug this all out and wrote about it extensively. But if you go back, and I'm actually working on a series about this in the Epoch Times newspaper right now. We just published the second installment about the history of public education. We have a very good article on that also in the special report I mentioned in the New American on how we got here. If you trace it back to the very, very beginning, public education as we know it today really began in Prussia. And the Prussian dictatorship, which was rather brutal, they got the idea from a guy called Robert Owen, who was a socialist. He was a communist before Karl Marx came along and really kind of popularized the idea of communism, and it failed miserably.
Oh, what? I'm so surprised about that.
Right. And so he actually set up this colony in Indiana called New Harmony, and it failed within 2 years. It was a total and complete disaster. And Robert Owen, instead of going back to the drawing board and say, wait a minute, maybe this collectivism actually wasn't such a good idea, maybe private property does play a useful role, he said, no, the problem is that we just didn't brainwash all the kids from the time they were little to be good collectivists. So what we really need to do... I'm
sensing a little bit of a repeat of history here and a model that keeps being used.
Oh, my goodness. Over and over again.
We just didn't do it right. We just need to go back and try it again.
We're always one execution away from utopia. It's always, right? It's just incredible how these people do. But Robert Owen came up with this idea that we just need to have the government take over education. And so he, with a fanatical zeal, determined that was going to be his life's mission. So he actually set up what some of his cohorts described as a secret society. One of the guys who blew the whistle on this, Orestes Brownson, he actually came to Christ and repented of all this. But he said that they had set up these secret societies, and he was one of the organizers in New York State. And he said their chief objective was to promote the idea of government taking over education. And fast forward to Horace Mann. Horace Mann took this idea that had taken root in Prussia and brought it to Massachusetts. This idea of government-controlled education, where you segregate the children by age, where you have education of the state, by the state, for the state. Wow. And he implemented this in Massachusetts. Gradually, it spread all across the United States. Then we had John Dewey pick up the baton, another communist. This guy went over to the Soviet Union and just loved what Lenin was doing, how they were instilling a collectivistic mindset into the children. And so, when you look at the history of what we have today, you realize it was actually intended primarily to facilitate the emergence of communism and the end of individual liberty. And so I think from that perspective, it was a huge mistake. I mean, if you look at this idea of, by its fruits, what were the fruits of this idea that the government should take over education? Total disaster. And so to kind of summarize, I think we made a big mistake letting government take over education. Education should be primarily a parental responsibility, and then the market and religious institutions ought to come in and supplement that. And, to people who say, well, kids aren't going to be able to get an education if the government doesn't control it, that's absolute baloney. Just go back and look at Massachusetts before the government took over education. Look at the United States before the government took over education. We were far better educated. I mean, light years ahead of where we are today. Just look at the literacy rates, right? In some areas of the United States, you had almost 100% literacy. Even in very, very uneducated areas, you had literacy rates over 80%, all the way up to the Civil War. And that's a documented fact. I mean, there's no debate about it. And then look at today, right? The literacy numbers aren't anywhere close to that. Washington, D.C., they say, according to the state education agency report, 2/3 of the adult population is functionally illiterate there. So the numbers don't even compare. And even poor people had a very good education back then. The churches ran schools, and if you couldn't pay, they would welcome you in anyways. The Quakers had a whole network of schools where you could come even if your parents couldn't pay a penny. Most basic education took place at home, right, from the parents, from the grandparents, from the older siblings. Most of our founding fathers were educated primarily at home. Not one of them ever stepped quite well before government education. And I think the American people have an understanding of this, even if it's just intuitive. The polls show that more than 7 out of 10 Americans would rather have their kids educated outside of government schools. It's just the problem is, well, can we afford it? Of course we can, right? That's where we have to get over.
That's what I hear a lot. Well, private education is so expensive. But I mean, if we're talking about the future of the country, I would assume, how important is your kid to you? But that's another. But before I dive into that, before I dive into that, you just opened my eyes on something that I didn't realize. I assumed that public education started with some kind of noble goal, and then the NEA came along and got usurped by leftism or Marxism or collectivism. And what you're telling me is, historically, this is rooted in leftism and Marxism.
Precisely. I mean, that's exactly right. And somebody might argue, I mean, it's a legitimate argument to say, well, Robert Owen was well-intentioned. He was a communist, yes, but he had good intentions.
The road to hell is
really,
paved with good intentions, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, and the same thing with Horace Mann. I don't have any smoking gun evidence that the guy was a maniac and knew that the ideology he was espousing would end up killing 300 million people in the 20th century. There's no evidence of that. Even John Dewey, you might say he was well-intentioned. The problem is, just like you said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So even if we assume that these guys really wanted the best, and we can give them the benefit of the doubt. They were doing this prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, the Communist Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, what we've seen in Venezuela. So in fairness, we can go back and say, hey, they didn't know that these ideas were going to result in the slaughter of hundreds of millions of people. Right? It actually, in this book, Is Public Education Necessary? Dr. Blumenfeld really gets to the core of this issue. What happened was, early Americans really came from a Calvinist perspective. They believed, as the Bible declares, that mankind has a sinful nature, an evil nature, a wicked nature, right? Man left to his own devices will lie, will cheat, will murder, will steal, all these different things. And so the people who settled and created America believed that, and that's why they really put incredibly serious restraints on the power of government. They knew that
decentralizing the power.
Exactly, and putting checks and balances in place and putting strict limits on what the government was authorized to do. Because even Thomas Jefferson, who was the closest to a non-Christian that we might have had among our founders, understood that mankind cannot be trusted with power because they tend to do evil things with it, right? And so
the heart in itself is wicked, and in it dwells no good thing.
Exactly, right? It is desperately wicked. And so the utopians who created the public school system rejected that view. Robert Owen was very clear that, I think mankind is innately good. Horace Mann thought the same thing. People are innately good. The problem is that the government isn't shaping their values properly and turning them into good little collectivists. That's why we have a problem. So if we could just educate all the kids in government schools, then we could change that. Well, they had a chance to try their idea. It was a total failure. But that really is the genesis of the public school system. It was an effort to fundamentally transform the mind, the soul, and even the character of the individual and more broadly of society at large. And, the best thing you can say about it is that it was utopian. These guys were just naive. They didn't really understand human nature. I consider these ideas to be self-evidently wicked. When you talk about removing people's right to decide their own career, their own decisions on their own property, their own decisions on how they're going to raise their children. I consider that to be de facto slavery. But other people can have different opinions. But I think when you boil it all down, the schools were set up for a specific purpose. We were promised all kinds of things, right? Horace Mann told us that if we just educated everybody in government schools, that 9/10 of the crimes in the penal code would become obsolete. Well, if you look at the crime rates back then and you look at them today, that was a bunch of baloney, right? So they were wrong. They were very clearly wrong. It was a big mistake. And, now we need to figure out how do we undo that mistake.
And speaking of $500 million question, where do we start? I wouldn't even know where to begin now, because another thing that happens is, and I hear this a lot from other parents, well, no, not my school. My school's not like that. And I'm like, yes, your school is like that.
But
right. So where do we begin?
Is we now have a national program. We have Common Core, right? We have Common Core is now a national set of education standards. The UN is coming in now with global education programs, and you can just go to UNESCO's website and read all about this. So as for your question, where do we start? I think the real place to start is to increase awareness. I would say 99 out of 100 Americans really don't understand the problem. Right? And so step one is going to have to be increasing awareness. And so that's why we put together this special report in the New American magazine. People can get a copy at thenewamerican.com/rescuingourchildren. That's why I went on this speaking tour, because the first thing is for the American people to understand what happened, what is happening, and what education used to look like before this disaster. So that's why we want to get 1 million copies of this out. That's why I'm traveling all across the country and even outside the country explaining all this to people. Because that's step one, right? A doctor cannot cure somebody if they don't have an accurate diagnosis of the problem. And so if we're going to cure this issue, we have to have, first of all, a correct diagnosis. And I think the next step is for people to get out of the public school system. I tell people it's kind of like a burning building. You would never send your children into a burning building. And if your children were in the burning building, you would run in there and grab them and run as fast as you could in the opposite direction. Why? Because their physical well-being is under threat in a burning building, right? And so when people tell me, well, I'm just going to go to every school board meeting, or I'm going to run for state legislature so we can try to stop that. You're going to do that while your kid's in a burning building? Give me a break, right? First, get your kids out. Then we'll talk about the burning building. And we do need to talk about the burning building. But the first step is for
stop
parents
the bleeding
across
and then treat, right?
Exactly, right? So parents, I compare it also to polishing the deck chairs on a sinking ship. You're going to go there and try to reform this sinking ship while it's sinking with your kids on it? Get off the ship already. Get on a lifeboat, right? Goodness gracious. It's a crazy idea. And so I think that's where we really need to begin. We already have about 15% of American children being educated outside of the government system. That's a good start. If we can get that up to 30, 40%, which, it's happening now. You have national leaders all across this country saying, get your kids out of public school. Rush Limbaugh said it recently, the biggest talk radio show host in America, 18 million listeners. You had Franklin Graham said it recently on Fox News, get your kids out of the schools if they're promoting this LGBT agenda, which is every school in this country. You had Mother Miriam, a very prominent Catholic nun. You had David Lane, a very prominent Christian Protestant leader who's got 80,000 pastors on his email list, said the same thing, get the kids out of the public schools. So things are changing. And if we can continue to increase the number of children who are being educated at home, who are being educated in private schools, Christian schools, Jewish schools, whatever it is, the system will collapse under the weight of these problems all on its own. And then we can get back to rebuilding on a solid foundation.
That sounds like a good plan to me. Like I said, you've given me, no pun intended, an education on this, because I just assumed that it started with good intentions and then leftism usurped it. Part 2 was the administrative state and the hierarchy that's in the education administrative state and how they're the leftists. But now you've kind of ruined my talking point, because it seems like it's all been steeped in leftism from the beginning and not usurped.
Well, it has, but it's gotten orders of magnitude worse. And if you look just at some of the anecdotal data, the Hill did an analysis of the political spending of the bureaucrats at the Department of Education in the 2016 election. 99.7% of the political donations went to the Hillary Clinton campaign. 0.3% went to the Donald Trump campaign. So that, that tells you at the very top. 99.7%, right? So maybe the janitor might have sent a small donation to Trump. Incredible numbers, but that's what people need to realize. All those Trump supporters out there who think they're going to send their children to public school and they're going to come out okay on the other end. These are the people who are educating your kids, right? The NEA is another huge problem. I mentioned Dr. Blumenfeld. He wrote, I think, the defining book on the NEA. It's called NEA, Trojan Horse in American Education. And he showed how literally communists from the very start of this organization were involved in dragging it further and further leftward, further and further toward collectivism. So, these are all legitimate issues. And you're right. Leftism has made it orders of magnitude worse. And if Robert Owen and Horace Mann would have known that one day this ideology of theirs would have culminated in drag queen story hours in first grade classrooms with men dressed in women's dresses with demon horns popping out of their head reading LGBT stories to children, I think even they would have had reservations.
Pump the brakes a little, yeah.
Yeah, I mean they would have said, whoa, so that's where this is all going to lead. Maybe that's not a good idea. But, it took a long time. It was a long process to get us where we are. It's going to take a long time to be able to turn it around and to fix it. But the reality is this system was started with the intention of collectivizing America, of undermining our heritage of individual liberty and God-given rights. And it's done its job very, very well, right? When people tell me they're going to reform the system because it's broke, I'm like, no, you don't understand. The system is doing exactly what it was meant to do, right? It's not broken. It's working
good point.
Perfectly.
Yeah, it's a fine-tuned machine.
It is. It really is. They told us that the purpose was to churn out little collectivists, and that's what they're doing, right? If you look at any poll today of young Americans, and I'm terribly embarrassed to be a millennial because, goodness gracious, it's embarrassing. But if you look at any poll of millennials today, the majority now will tell you they are socialists. They would rather live under a socialist system than a free system. Generation Z is even worse, right? So the school system is doing exactly what it was intended to do. It took us a long time to get here. America was set up on very solid foundations, so they couldn't just erode it all in a generation or two. It took many generations to get us where we are today, and it's going to take generations to turn this around if there's going to be any chance of doing it. But we need to realize that, this was the goal from the start. They've been tremendously successful. We see it now. I mean, we see the fruit of it now, right? The school shootings and the drug use and the abortions and the collapse of the family and the $23 trillion in debt, the $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities just at the federal level. I mean, our society is in the process of collapse, and this was all made possible. In fact, it would not have been possible had it not been for the indoctrination and the dumbing down of our people over a period of multiple generations.
That's scary stuff. As far as my estimation goes, we're just now becoming more aware of it, more cognizant of it. And people like you out on the front lines doing this, I mean, God bless you. I mean, because we have an uphill battle now.
Oh, we absolutely do. The battle would seem insurmountable. If I wasn't a Christian, I would probably be, building myself a bunker on a deserted island somewhere because things look really bad.
Joining Jesse Ventura and like being a prepper
right.
and
That's exactly right. Yeah,
we're going underground.
But throughout history, Christians have always been a minority. The odds have always been against us, and yet, look what our founders produced here in America. Right? They produced this amazing nation. The odds were, look at our founding fathers. They went up against the most powerful empire probably that had ever existed in human history, right? The British military was global in scope. It was massive. It was well-funded. It was technologically more advanced than anybody in the world. And, a bunch of ragtag farmers here in the colonies were like, yeah, you know what? We're not going to take orders from you anymore. We're tired of being taxed without representation. If someone had looked at that objectively from the outside and said, what are the odds that these ragtag farmers and militia guys are going to succeed? You'd have been a total kook to bet on the American colonists. And yet, they won, right? They put their trust in God. They took on this massive, seemingly undefeatable machine, and they won. And so I take inspiration from that. I take inspiration from the fact that I know that God is ultimately sovereign, and that gives me courage. That gives me encouragement to keep on fighting, even if the odds look insurmountable, because they do. We have to be clear about that. We have to be honest about that. This challenge is enormous. It's massive. It's bigger than any of us would be able to deal with on our own. But ultimately, I'm hopeful. I think actually things in some respects are going in a very positive direction. The number of homeschoolers is increasing drastically every year. So there's good things happening too, and I'm very encouraged by that.
Well, Alex, I want to thank you for being on the program today. You've given us a lot to think about, and you've given us some encouragement as well, and some cautious encouragement that we know that we're fighting an uphill battle. And as far as resources, the book you co-authored was called Crimes of the Educators?
That's right. It's Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. So that'll give you, the whole explanation of why America has now become a nation of massive illiteracy. And the simple introductory tool that we're asking people to get copies of and help distribute, it's the special report on education in the New American magazine. We published it on February 4th. People can get copies at thenewamerican.com/rescuingourchildren. We've got versions of my talk all over YouTube. We've got them on DVD if people want to hand them out. And so what we're asking is, if you're listening to this and you think, wow, maybe he's right. Don't take my word for any of this stuff. I always tell people, whip out your smartphones and fact check everything I'm saying. But if you agree that this is serious, you need to look into it, get a copy of this special report, fact check everything in here. And then when you realize that every word of this is true and the future of our liberties, our families, our churches, and our republic are at stake, go ahead and get involved. Order 10 copies or 20 copies or 50 copies of this magazine and distribute them to opinion molders in your community. Get them to your pastor. Get them to the public school teachers that you know. Get them to the elders at your church, to your state representative, your school board member, people of influence. And I think that's really the only way that we're going to be able to make progress is by average, everyday Americans who are concerned about these things getting involved and helping to spread the word. And so I would ask people, if you're concerned about this stuff, look into what we're saying. Go to thenewamerican.com/rescuingourchildren. Get a copy of this magazine. You can get it in PDF if you want, or we'll pay the shipping and handling. If you want to get a print one, just use the promo code EDUCATE19. You can get a copy, and we'd love to send you one. And if you agree that this is important, please get involved in this battle. Everybody can do something, right?
Yes, sir. Amen. Alex Newman, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.
And that will do it for us at Publitarian Podcast. As always, if you want to reach out to me, you can. You can DM me on Instagram. I am Publitarian on all the social medias. You can email me at publitarian@gmail.com or thepublitarian@gmail.com. We'll see you guys on the next one. Thank you.
You've been listening to Publitarian Podcast. Copyright 2019.